Amistad Rivers presents a conversation with Troy Montes Michie and Andrea Andersson.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Christopher Harder. I'm the Interim Executive Director at the Amistad Research Center. And on behalf of Amistad and our partners at the Rivers Institute, we'd like to welcome you to tonight's conversation. This conversation is the culmination of artist Troy Montes Michie's time with us in New Orleans, time at Amistad exploring our collections, which is going to be the topic of tonight's talk. This is part of a artist in residency program that is sponsored by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We'd like to thank the Mellon Foundation for their support. We'd like to thank our partners at Rivers Institute, the Jazz Museum for hosting us tonight, Troy and Ashley for joining us in what's going to be a wonderful conversation. And we'd like to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us this evening. And I'd like to turn it over to Jordan from the Rivers Institute to give some introductions tonight.
Hi, I hate speaking in front of a microphone, so I'm going to make this very quick. My name is Jordan Amirkhani. I am a curator with the Rivers Institute here in New Orleans. I am delighted to have Troy and Ashley with us this evening, and I just wanted to give a little bit of some context for what Rivers is about and what we are doing here, and then give some introductions to our artists, and we'll be good to go. So Rivers was founded in 2020. And Rivers is a nonprofit institute committed to the art of the diaspora. Based in New Orleans, a community whose history and futures are predicated upon and consigned to migration, Rivers invests in long-form projects with artists who draw from and give form to diasporic conditions. Rivers' partnership with Amistad Research Center affirms our commitments to advance contemporary art that makes a study of history through the wealth of the archive. Together, we welcome artists from around the world to New Orleans for extended research and study as they develop new work or immerse themselves in new areas of interest. So without further ado, I will move on to introductions. Troy Montes Michie. Through assemblage and juxtaposition, Troy Montes Michie engages Black consciousness, Latinx experience, immigration, and queerness, and investigates the ways in which bodies of marginalized communities are frequently erased and fetishized. Montes Michie holds a BFA from the University of Texas at El Paso and an MFA from Yale School of Art. His works have been recently included in exhibitions at the Institute for Contemporary Art at VCU Richmond, the MAC in Belfast, the Shed in New York, the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, and the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, where his work is currently on display. He is currently a lecturer of visual art in the Visual Arts program at Princeton University. Ashley Teamer. Ashley Teamer's collages explores the relationships between the body, nature, space, and time. She uses painting, sculpture, photography, and sound to creatively intervene with indoor and outdoor architecture, revealing the malleability of our built environment. She has been an artist in residence at Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture and the Joan Mitchell Center here in New Orleans. Teamer received a BFA from Boston University in 2013 and an MFA from Yale University in 2022. Her work has been most recently exhibited as a series of billboards called Lady Blue Devils in New Orleans. And our moderator tonight is Andrea Andersson, who serves as founding director and chief curator of Rivers Institute for Contemporary Art and Thought. She is co-curator of Troy Montes Michie Rock of Eye, now on view at Cam Houston, and Ito Barada Ways to Baffle the Wind, now on view at Mass MoCA. Previous curatorial projects include Sanford Bigger's Code Switch, Adam Pendleton Becoming Imperceptible, Cecilia Vicuña About to Happen, Joachim Nordstrom Why Is Everything a Rag, Keith Calhoun and Chandra McCormick Labor Studies, and Hinge Picture 8 Women Occupy the Third Dimension, among others. She has taught at Barnard College and New York University, and she is an alumna of Stanford University, where she received her BA, and Columbia University, where she received her MA, MPhil, and PhD. So without further ado, I'll let you guys take it over. Thank you.
Welcome to everyone who joins us here tonight. We are so happy to finally welcome Troy into conversation in New Orleans with artist Ashley Teamer. I've had the pleasure of knowing Ashley pretty much since I moved back to New Orleans in 2015, and to know her practice prior to her recent adventures in MFA land. And I have had the great fortune to work with Troy over the last few years on the publication for Rockavai, the subsequent exhibition, which opened at the California African American Museum in LA and is now on view at Cam Houston, and now together as an Amistad-Rivers Research Resident. I was trying to do the math last night, and I think it was about 5 years ago, which seems insane, but I think so, when I first reached out to Troy in another life, another incarnation, I think, for both of us, with interest in developing an exhibition together. And I mentioned this sort of historical moment mostly to acknowledge sort of the beautiful out-of-orderedness of everything that we have done together. Troy was to have been, as context, our first Amistad-Rivers Research Resident. And then a thing called the pandemic came and intervened. And so we began at the other end. And we actually began with the book for Rockavai, which then led to the exhibition of Rockavai. And then now into new research in Amistad's archive. And because of this sort of transposition of time, instead of mining an archive of other people's historical materials, you began by mining your own archive and revisiting kind of earlier work as fugitive fragments and reimagining them. Ashley, you've also worked with archival material, both the material remnants of another's practice and public material, as well as personal material. And so, in thinking about archival practice and its necessarily out of orderedness, I want to begin by asking kind of what's the difference between using an archive of others, an archive that's housed in a place like Amistad, and returning to your own work as archival material and that kind of self-reflection and treatment. Who wants to go first?
Using an archive of others. I don't. In many ways, I think the archive of others feels very similar to my own explorations. Like as a kid, I was really into looking at photographs with my grandmother and hearing about stories and just kind of being baffled how people looked different beyond my existence. And even in the archive, going into the space, there's something for me just very important about kind of sifting through the remnants of existence. So like reading a letter, I don't know, there's something very personal about it. And I gravitate to that kind of energy, but also, I don't know, there's just something for me that's very powerful to see the trace of a letter that somebody wrote who is no longer alive, or a photograph that was taken, and not knowing any idea of like the circulation that photograph would end up being in an archive, and I'd be looking at it now in 2022. So in a lot of ways, I think mining the archives helped me, I guess, broaden my own story, to kind of take myself out of this more kind of personal, familial space.
Mm-hmm. We were talking just the other day about, kind of some of the earliest work I saw of yours was work that included, say, WNBA cards. It took you someplace different than maybe some more recent work that really draws from your own personal experience.
Yeah, I think I liked what you were saying about the seeing yourself in a different way. And I think that's kind of what led me to basketball cards and sports cards in general, because before that I was making abstract paintings that felt like very much internal, but also open. I don't know, there was a very internalness to it that I was really enjoying exploring at that time, but I gravitated towards the decisiveness of these images because of what they kind of reflected back at me that I really needed in that moment, which was like a type of like strength and perseverance that I just needed. That's what I needed. And so I was like, I need to go find that. And I think in an interesting way, it like took me back to my own history, which is that my grandmother was a basketball coach. So I think it's kind of, it's a interesting thing to look for something outside of yourself that like ultimately does like lead you back into a back door, and you're like, oh my gosh, like,
That's
I
mine.
would have never gotten here if I hadn't like gone on this more longer journey searching. And there's like a searching to it.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting to see, as we have invited artists into Amistad's archive to see where they begin and where they end, but also where they find themselves. I think that there's a huge part of archival work that is about locating oneself in that archive as well. Troy, you and I began thinking about a show that is completely different than the show that we realized, which is super fun. But that show had what, in our earliest conversations, it was about putting in the foreground the female figure. Much of your practice has really looked at histories of the male figure, and in order to do that, it felt important to trace your own matriarchal history. And then that became a little bit too personal, and you found. So I'm curious about that that place where it gets too much oneself, but also that avenue that you found that maybe that brought you back to that same body of material, but through a public framework.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like there's going to be so much to be said after these years that we've all been living in the pandemic. And one thing, I had just gotten a Hodder fellowship, so I felt really lucky because I didn't have to teach during that crazy time. I kind of bypassed it, but I just really wanted to do something as a thank you to the women in my family, like these amazing matriarchs who raised me. And I don't know, I always I had a very close relationship with my grandmother, and I wanted to just do something as like a thank you. Even though, I mean, she already knows how much I did appreciate her. But as I was like racking my brain, I think for almost years and years, and I went home, I got all my family photographs, I scanned them all. I was trying to make collages with them. But the tricky thing was, I realized with the work that I was doing with the erotic magazines, I couldn't approach the material in the same way because it was in a very different sentiment. And the other work was more about confusing this kind of fetishistic gaze for the viewer. And this one was more of like a sentimental one and a personal one. But I don't know, like sometimes when I'm making, I feel like I forget my own practice. And I'm like, wait, you always start off super literal. And like, what's the next phase? And for me, it was abstraction, which then led to me reading the book, The Woman in the Zoot Suit, and really kind of seeing what they termed as like an aberrant, like feminism, kind of to the women in my family, because they ran the show. Like they did whatever they wanted, and I loved it.
Troy recently, in coordination with our exhibition Rock of Eye, had the opportunity to be in conversation with Catherine Esther Ramirez, the author of Woman in Zoot Suit. And we'll be showing some pictures in a moment, and a lot of your practice has really taken the shape and history of the zoot suit to unpack all sorts of histories of subjectivity, but to see that it was a really sort of late stage in our project, which actually brought us back to the beginning, which where we thought we were going to be foregrounding the female figure, and then we were, but at the very end, through female zoot suiters. I think this question of visibility, and that part of that, what we're talking about is who gets shown and who is seen, but the question of visibility and what's private and what's public, I think in the context of an archive, is also about what is the history that gets told, right? It's something that we've spoken about a lot at Amistad, together with Jade Flint, who is in the room, who works together with Amistad and Rivers, and who has been part and of this project since its origin, helping to cull materials, but also interested in what materials historically have, what's been kept and what's been circulated. Both of your practices lean into questions of visibility in really significant ways. And I want to kind of pull out a little bit further here. We've talked a lot about, I think in your practice, this question about intentional obscurity, what is censored is really foregrounded. And there are multiple ways, Troy, that you toy with the questions of visibility. And I think, I wonder if you could share a little bit about the way that you have made use of archival erotic magazines, but also their censorship, their circulation in the history of your practice.
I think the first time I started using them, it came out of a place where, I went to school for painting, and I would realize like halfway through.
Neither of them paint today.
Yeah. But then I realized, I was like, wait, I don't have to paint everything. And I discovered collage. And so I would glue in physique pictorial magazines, but I would draw over the figures to make them brown. And that was kind of the first time I ever used them. But the more I started to look at that history, I don't know. I had just come out of the closet. I was feeling just very I didn't see any representation of queerness for POC identity in El Paso because it's such a Catholic community. Mm-hmm. So everything I saw was representations of white men who had certain body types. And the more I started to research that, the more I started to find out about these magazines that were kind of catered towards that specific gaze, consuming black bodies or brown bodies kind of as objects. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to just confuse that gaze to try to bring about some type of autonomy. Even if it wasn't a total transformation, for me, the slightest shift could be kind of a step towards confusing kind of their static placement throughout history.
Mm-hmm. When I went to your show in Houston, I was my friend and I were both looking at so much motion. So there's also a sense of because it's being obscured, it kind of puts the figure into emotion or something. So they're kind of going away from you or going towards you, getting really, really close or going far away, which I think also kind of gives them agency too, because they're moving around in a way.
There's also the sense of expectation about them. That they will be very revealing. Mm-hmm. And I share this story because I share it with everyone everywhere now because I hate it so much. But recently, I was locked out of my Dropbox account because of Troy. But what I thought, we've talked a lot about this as an organization. First, is there any other option? What other instrument can we use? But it was because I had violated the terms of use of Dropbox because of Troy. And what is so fascinating about it is that there's actually nothing explicit in any of the collages.
It's because of the images.
It's because of the images. I had well, they said I had child pornography on my Dropbox, which I don't. But it was, I think it was this really interesting, and if I do, so do many other people in this room. But it was an interesting moment of recognizing that sort of expectation for a kind of work, right? That there's a historical, even gaze that you recognize. I already know what this material is without any kind of looking, but this brings, I think the conversation back, and we were having lots of conversations about it because, of course, we had written a great deal about censorship in the context of your work, and the changing nudity laws around print publication. And I'm curious how that history informs your work with the material.
I think I was kind of into the fact that it was presented as a men's workout magazine, mm-hmm. and it was pocket-sized to reach kind of not large urban areas. Mm-hmm. So inherently the magazine was a facade and that it was showing kind of these like youthful, muscular men as a way of being like, they did these workouts, but there was no workouts in the magazines. It was just kind of showing off the physique. So for me, it kind of always, I don't know, it kind of was proof that there was always an alternative lifestyle, like just below, I don't know, like underneath the type of veil, where like I saw those type of magazines in the 90s when I'd go to Walgreens and my grandma would pick up her prescriptions. And I'd be like, I don't know about this workout magazine because it's a little different than what I'm used to looking at. But I kind of feel like that was a marker where I first realized that maybe there was something a little bit different with my own sexuality. Yeah, but I don't know, they were very fascinating just thinking about this coded language in terms of like symbols that would help the viewer to see like the personality of the model. But then again, it only kind of amplified white queerness. And then if it was a person of color, then they were a stereotype.
There's another way that you have treated visibility or explored visibility in your practice, and that has to do with the history of camouflage. You grew up in El Paso, one of the largest military bases in the country is there. Can you talk a little bit about your use of camouflage in your collages?
Camouflage came about, I don't know, I always feel like I say too much. But it's like every artist knows that dreaded moment where when you're applying to applications and you're like, what is my work about? And you're just like staring at the work, hoping it's going to speak to you. And of course, I know what it's about, but it's like, how can I filter it in this official language that's going to get me this grant? And
I don't know what you're talking about.
oh my God. And this word camouflage just kept coming up. And a lot of times in my practice, it's not only images that I collect, but phrases from things that I read, but I also research a lot with word lists. And I started to research camouflage, and I was just really struck by its whole history, not only growing up in El Paso and seeing desert camo my whole life, but also that artists had a huge hand in developing camouflage theory at the exact same time as the zoot suit, like the zoot suit heyday. So early or late 1930s, early 1940s. And I was fascinated by this one term called disruptive patterning, which is not about invisibility, but it's more about a confusion of the eye. And for me, that's how I saw, I was trying to kind of think about the gaze of how people in that time were looking at the zoot suiter as an oddity, as something confusing that they couldn't understand. So that's kind of how I gravitated towards disruptive coloration or pattern.
Actually, in our conversations, you used the word, and we laughed about it. The word tessellation came up more than once, and the way that you use ornamentation, I mean, the way that you use patterning is not strictly ornamentation. There is a kind of disruption of visibility, and I wonder if you can speak to how you understand that in your collages.
Yeah, I try to also disrupt and confuse, but in a way that merges different moments all into one. So like in this piece right here, which actually has my brother in it, I kind of like have all these moments that I'm seeing through the camera that I remember are related. And then I kind of use them to create a new environment. So like there's I don't know if y'all know the like pond in the botanical garden that has black water, like the water is black, and they have these really bright green lily pads. And so whenever I was looking at it, I was like, oh, this is like night, like day for night, where like if I put a moon here, it would look like this was at nighttime. And so I'm really excited by creating those relationships across different moments. And I kind of like saw that too in your show, Troy, because I was just enjoying like the how the stitching together, like it blurs it, but then at the same time, like you are forced to focus on different moments that are like more textured, I guess, but from the play. So it's like both specific, it's both very specific, but then also like breaks it open for more interpretation by using through using reality, which is like the fun thing that I love about collage, is it allows you to reach abstraction and representation simultaneously.
I have this image up also just because the kind of, my sense is that whenever I see pattern in your work, you are troubling it. You are causing trouble. But this work is also that space of like, there's a kind of confusion, I think, to the function of reflection and visibility in terms of mirroring. And I wonder if you can share a little bit more.
Yeah, with this piece, so the part that's a little bit cropped, there's the word Mississippi, and then river is in the front of the chair. And so what I did was I created this font that's like kind of Gothic, but I spread the word out. So like the first line is like M a bunch of times, and then ISS, and then you can see like the is. So I wanted people to look at it and then try to start to hear it in their minds, and that kind of abstraction and stretching like slows down your read of the object or the image, which kind of, you're trying to like get ideas in people's minds. Like, you have to like slow it down so that it's more embodied than just like, oh, I looked at it, I got it, bye.
In terms of invisibility, I think another tool both of you use to get ideas in people's minds, and this goes back to my Dropbox a little bit, is we're gonna keep it back, is by not showing. It's that moment where you take away. And Ashley, you have been, I'm going to bring up a little bit of work here. That's just a beautiful work. So I'll just put that right there. You've been doing a lot of work lately that does it about something that you don't show.
Yeah.
And that's about something that here in New Orleans, we often can't see. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're looking at?
Yeah,
we're not looking at.
This is London Avenue, one of the sections of London Avenue Canal levee walls. And for the past, I think, year, I've been working on a public art project that has to do with the transformation of Gentilly into a place where water can actually flow through freely. So I just became super hyper focused on all of the walls that kind of surround us and all of the water that is traveling below our feet, that controls where we can physically move and also controls where water can move. And then of course there's always a rupture. And so I think, and that also kind of like mirrors with life, and our bodies are ruptured and surfaces can be ruptured. But yeah, all of the water is hidden. So I think I've been going around, this is the Bonacary Spillway, and just kind of like looking at and observing these places that I've seen my whole life and that we've seen our whole lives that we just kind of let pass by, and really thinking about just like Native communities and other people that have developed ways of living with water that are not through concrete, but through more porous surfaces.
Did you say porous? Sorry.
Yes, there's always something it's always going to get through. And I think that's growing up here. We were talking about this, like you don't grow up with the knowledge that something, now you do, but like before Katrina, it wasn't a knowledge that it's always, the water is going to come through.
Does this come? Oh, not good. It's the video, but it doesn't appear to be videoing. It doesn't want to video anymore.
Maybe press spacebar?
I'll do what you say.
Oh.
This is why we invite the artist.
I guess, should I go?
Just listen for just a second. Listen. Can you hear? So can you tell us a little bit about that installation?
Oh, yes. I have been experimenting with using sound emanating from a sculpture as kind of like, I guess, the way that water might travel through, like the Mississippi River travels through, water travels through any space. It like forms to that space. And so I've been experimenting with creating these sculptures that emit sound, and that sound will then change the character of the space. So with that piece, I originally came up with it during like deep COVID, when at my school they got rid of all the furniture so no one could sit together. And there was no furniture like 1 week before I put that piece up there, but I put it there because there was a fountain that I was passing by, and I just wanted to like change the character of that location, which was so, again, like concrete, solid, like non-porous and very austere. And so this is another piece that I made, and this one kind of like emitted a very like pulsing beat throughout the space, which actually I ended up feeling like was actually a little bit too appropriate for the space. Like it was very much like went along with white gallery walls. And so now I'm kind of experimenting with using samples and beats that are more disruptive, or just like to completely change the vibe of wherever it's located.
Now it works. But this, coming back to the pictures of the levee walls, borderlands, levees, passport checks, all the ways that we control movement and bodies. This question of the borderland has loomed large in our practice. And one of the archival materials that really started the process of Rockavai was really looking at Gloria Anzaldua's La Frontera. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that publication and its importance to you as an artist.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the first books that I read later after graduating. And it was actually recommended to me by a grad student I was doing a visit with. And they're like, everything that your work is, you need to read this book. And Iris, shout out to Iris. And I read it, and I'd never read anything that encapsulated what it was like to grow up on the border in terms of speaking Spanglish. It's written in English and Spanish. It also goes back and forth between text and poetry. And as a Chicana feminist, like she even talks about queerness, which is a very taboo thing in the Southwest. And I kind of just like the way that I'm not going to quote it correctly, but she talks about borderlands in a very kind of broad way in terms of like queer bodies, in terms of landscapes, in terms of borders that are created by man, in terms of borders that are created by nature, like language borders. It's just very expansive.
You've told the story before about first arriving in. I love the story, so I always ask you. I love the story because I think it tells us so much. I mean, there's one of the things I like about this conversation is the sort of hyper-local experience that figures in both of your practices. And when you actually are like, that spot in the Botanical Gardens, and like half the room is like, yeah, I know the spot. But I think similarly, like when you have talked about Troy, like that move from being in El Paso to showing up in New Jersey, and it's not the same. We all speak these sort of hyper local dialects, and that those are visual dialects, those are experiential. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about crossing state lines in the northeastern corridor.
The story she wants me to tell. Yeah, so I mean, my family, we didn't really have money to be vacationing all the time, so we went to either southern New Mexico or other parts of Texas. It still never made it to Houston until this year because it was 12 hours away from El Paso. So we stuck till like Austin was the end mark. But when I went to grad school, that was like the first time I left Texas was to do an undergrad fellowship at Yale. Actually, this is when it happened, at Yale Norfolk. And one of the painters, she had a car, and she's like, we're going to drive to Rhode Island. And so I was like, man, I'm going to be in this car forever because Texas is so big. And we were there in like a very short amount of time, and I was confused. And I was like, where's the checkpoint where we have to weigh the car and they ask us if we're American? And she was like, what are you talking about?
It doesn't have that checkpoint.
I just thought that every time you crossed a state, there was always that kind of highly like militarized presence, which I grew up in, and I didn't realize that was unusual because El Paso is like you had the troops like the army troops, you had border patrol, you had the FBI, you had the police department. And for me, that was all just kind of what El Paso was. So going to the East Coast, one, I was shocked about how quickly you could travel to other states. But also that you didn't have
Texas
to
is big.
constantly, mark yourself as I am American, I am legal.
That sense of expansiveness, though, I want to also kind of take a note for that, because it was such a part of our research and our making of the book, and that, you know, the voluminous nature of the pant leg of a zoot suit, but the expansiveness of the desert. I mean, all of this sense of non-border, like where we don't reach the edge, was such a big part of our thinking, I think, for the book and for the exhibition. There was a moment, though, I'm just being reminded right now of when we were installing in Los Angeles, and there was a work of Troy's. We were suspending two garments, and up on a wire across there was a wire across the gallery, and someone from the museum who's really in charge of making sure everyone's safe when they enter it was really concerned about this threshold. How are they going to delineate it and mark it for a public and an audience? You know, we're going to have kids in here, and it kind of strange that cut the wire was like perfectly neck height. So, you know, you could be running across and not see it. And so they had proposed some wall text, and there was a moment where there was this question about putting on the wall, you know, attention, or some kind of language to say, you know, you might run into a wire. But it was interesting. We immediately pulled back, because that the resonance of being mindful in a gallery space, it was, you know, was so quickly mirrored by the language of any kind of border, right, and the danger that's associated with it. And I think for all of us, there was that kind of revelation of the way that our bodies are managed and protected and controlled in space, but very much in museums, right? Like how we talk about borderlands, but how also is subjectivity controlled in these kinds of institutional spaces. And that echo was really hard not to notice. But with that, I want to ask both of you really about the way that you think about borderlands in a formal sense in your work, because my sense is that both of you really turn to like lineations and thresholds and opportunities for trespassing, crossing over. Ashley, you're nodding, so I want to know what you're thinking in your head.
Well, when you said the museum, I was like, that's kind of why I got into using sound, because I like needed to break the walls between spaces, and like, oh, y'all's work is over here and your work is over here. I'm like, it's everywhere. Catch it. But your story about going to New Jersey reminded me that I went to a residency on a sailboat in like 2015, and only then did I realize that I was surrounded by walls, that the water wasn't something I could ever reach. And people were like, what's your project on the boat? Like, what are you going to be doing? And I was reading like Octavia Butler and just like communing with the water. And it took me a while. I didn't realize that kind of just got my mind going on this path of like breaking down, because I just didn't realize that that it was something you couldn't see. And I was like, oh, the reason why this sailing trip is really affecting me is because in my life growing up, the water is always hidden. And but yet affecting my life, like so much pressure on the walls of our lives are happening. So it makes sense that now I'm realizing, now we're talking, that like, you know, boom, wall sewing and breaking down to refigure would be like a liberatory practice, or like a freeing practice, because of the rigidity of the architecture that we're surrounded by. Or
speaking of architecture, I have an image from an installation of yours up right now that draws from New Orleans-based architecture and porch work, and you know that sense of boundary of the walls that's missing, but it's there. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how you gesture towards breaking through the wall, but through the use of architectural remnant.
Yeah, Well, so I think it was kind of a logistical challenge where I was like, I want to change the space, but like I don't have the time, or like I don't have the time to just change the entire thing. And so I had to get more just not gestural, but more creative with how you could change something. And I think that kind of is my like little TED talk, soapbox, is that like, we can do small things to change the world that we live in. And so in this situation, I was like, okay, I can't like make this into a porch, but I can like give the porch energy, which would be like taking this pattern. Like I was walking in Mid-City, I took a picture of the porch, I like copied that little kind of star-shaped pattern along the sides and then made my own little design with it. But there's something about framing a place differently. And then these also emitted the sound that was Big Timers instrumentals with river sounds in between. Mm-hmm. But yeah, like, and I love places where people have to pass through because they're kind of being washed with whatever you're putting out. And then also, I mean, like, we're constantly passing through time. People are passing through dimensions of life and death. Like,
Porosity of boundary.
Yeah, we're like constantly passing through something. And so I feel like highlighting that is also like a very effective, to reach the people.
Yeah. Passing through, I want to go back a couple of steps. So when we were first making the book, and you were scanning and working through old archival materials that had been used that you'd used before in collages, and I think this was a moment of even turning back to one's practice and recognizing it as remnant of a historical practice, right? And repurposing and thinking freshly about some of these same materials. And so one of the materials that we returned to again and again were clothing patterns. These clothing patterns that you collected are suggestive, certainly, and figure into the life of the zoot suit, which has played such a central place in your practice. But they also became very swiftly a kind of cartography. Mm-hmm. And it was really hard not to see something that is more commonly applied to the body also be a map of landscape. And so in our galleries, we're glad to have the work of Leslie Khan, a really wonderful graphic designer, to transpose some of those for floor works. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how these have, how the work to garment production has also become a kind of wayfinding structure in your own collage.
I mean, I kind of like what you mentioned about framing. I mean, I don't even know who made the quote, but past is present. Like that's something I'm always thinking of, and that can happen in architecture. But in terms of the clothing pattern, it frames our bodies. But even, I don't know, I've always been really interested in subcultures and the way by what people wear, they're marked, kind of in this type of performative way. One, not always for performance, but sometimes it's just for personal identity, and that even becomes, I don't know, skewed. But with the patterns, I kind of like thinking that people, I don't think I've ever encountered somebody that's afraid to cross the threshold of the vinyl, and that's something that I enjoy growing up in a place, like hearing you talk about walls and rupture. I mean, in a very different context, the El Paso is all kind of along the line of the Rio Grande, which there was a fence even before Bush built the other fence. So it's kind of like living in a space where you're constantly reminded that there's another side. You're constantly seeing that wall, but then also being really young as a kid and thinking there's someone else on the other side having the same experience, almost like a parallel kind of universe. But what I enjoyed about the patterns is, I don't know, I love teaching. Like, I learned a lot from my students. And teaching drawing, I was like, oh yeah, I used to love drawing. Like, I forgot about all of these things I would do. So in a way, the clothing pattern became like a talisman of another drawing, but a drawing that's flat, but then becomes form, which then kind of envelops a body. And similarly with the sewing, even though it's along the lines of what the machine can do, it almost feels like mark making for me. But I'm interested in the stitch as being something that's an attempt to try to make a dialogue, but knowing that that stitch will always come apart. Like if there's too much pressure on either side.
It's I want to go back to one thing that you said a moment ago, was that you haven't seen anyone who didn't want to cross the vinyl. And I think to see in the installation of Rockavai, this was true at Cam Houston and true at Cam in LA and as well as Cam Houston. There's a lot of vinyl on the ground that you'd have to really play hopscotch for. But it also necessarily requires the public to trespass over and over, right? To one, am I stepping on the art? I'm stepping on the art. Oh, we're all stepping on the art, and but that invitation to cross the line again and again across the exhibition. Okay, so you both want to talk about the stitch. It's clear. We said we were going to hold the stitch.
She brought it up first.
We promised we were going to hold the stitch. But one of the let's take a look. Well, first we'll hold Gloria and Zildua just for a moment. We lay enclosed by margins, hems where only we existed. One of the things that made us want to hold this conversation today, at least one of the things that made me want to hold this conversation today, was just the fact that these are two artists that whose practices are both rooted in histories and practices of collage, but have both found their way to sewing and stitch making and these forms of suturing. And I think, we were having conversations the other day that the history of collage, and particularly because of its sort of early 20th century relevance, is often associated with histories of rupture, of violence, of the cut, grown out of years of war and dislocation. And there is something else happening in your practice. And I think the moment that you invite the needle and the thread into the practice, there's also a reparative practice at play. And in your TED talk that you gave just moments ago, there's these moves that you can make that can change. They can be small and they can change everything. And that's been, we've talked about this in your very subtle moves sometimes in collage. They're not radical gestures. They're slight adjustments, and then they're sewn. Sewing can be associated and has been associated with histories of domestic practice. We sew wounds, we suture. And so I'd love to hear how both of you arrived at thread in your collages.
You want me?
Well, when you said that it was something that can be changed, I feel like that is interesting because it's kind of what brought me to it, was that it had a sense of tightness to it and like permanence, because I was very much in like the glue X-Acto knife tape world. And I just needed it to be stronger, because I just needed the piece to be able to move. And you can see in this one, I will be, I'll have different parts that I want to thread together, and I just want to move it around. And think that the threading, sewing, I was like, oh, this is the most practical choice. But then I didn't, when I started getting into it, I was just kind of being taken away by the sewing machine, the very, the ability to do it in a way where I don't have a pattern, and I can just kind of let it be what it is, which is in stark contrast to having to maybe repeat the same stitches every day, knowing that that's the just keeping that in my mind, that's the other use of this machine and this technology is more and more efficiency to move more quickly. And I find myself being less and less efficient and sewing over and over the same thing, and cutting them out and repositioning. And that's just
that's how you got to thread.
Because it was just, and then it became a whole other world.
How did I guess I got to thread. For me, it's almost like when I'm doing these projects, not like I'm an actor, but it's almost like I'm a character actor, right? So I'm going through all the research, I'm listening to music from the time, I'm watching films from the time, and it made sense that I should kind of enact the language of the seamstress or the tailor for the collage, just to get a sense of what it meant to make a garment. I still cannot make a garment, but I can work a machine now. And I was really afraid to, because I was like, I don't know how to sew anything. And I'd seen too many horror films of like people sewing their fingers, which actually seems really hard now that I sew. I'm like, how are they doing that? Like, that seems really hard to do. And I had a friend who had a machine. I tried it on one of the woven drawings and it worked. So I was like, get out of the way. And then I just like went to town. I learned, because that machine busted. So I learned that when you're sewing things you're not supposed to, the machine it'll break. So now I'm a lot nicer with my machine, but I think there is something about the thread as well, with going back to Anzaldúa. She has this quote talking about the border as un herida abierta, which is an open wound. And so for me, like the thread almost becomes this way of trying to suture or make sense of these kind of two worlds. But also, but also it's kind of freeing. I feel like in these pandemic times I've tried so many forms of meditation. So sometimes in my studio it feels meditative because you have to be present because you're using knives and things. But with the sewing machine, it's like I can't not be present because I can't watch a film. Like I have to just kind of use the machine while I'm using it and be present in that moment and always vigilant.
Both of you have used thread, but you've also you use grommets. That was in this past piece, and
I love grommets.
and they're in a number of pieces. And this is a work. It's a little bit hard to see in this image, but this is a very long linear run of smaller works that are connected by zippers, vertical zippers. And I mention this because both the grommet and the zipper is suggestive of, and I don't know that you would do this, but that one could reassemble. It could be reassembled differently, right? This could be reordered. And I want to use this to come back to the archive. This question about taking materials and the subtle shifts we make, and sometimes the major leaps we make, and to work in a historical archive and to draw out that relationship and assemble adjacent to contemporary work, contemporary moment. How do you think about reassembly? What role does temporal reassembly as well as kind of material reassembly play in your practice?
I think there's when I was looking at like basketball cards or even my grandmother's photos from when she was a coach, there was so much potential energy in the imagery that I'm like looking at that made me really excited. Like there's we're just saying about like the like meditative like act of sewing. There's like also a meditation or a kind of imagination emotional journey, maybe you could talk about this too, of like going through archival images or images from the past, whether it's your personal past or someone else's past, that just you're like, oh, this is something. And I think like choosing the way it's gonna go is kind of like sacrificing all the other possible ways it could go. And so I like using grommets because I'm like, oh, I could change it, it could totally change. But I think when you're looking upon the past and thinking about all the stories that all of the stories that come from that one moment, you kind of do have to be like, okay, I'm gonna follow this emotional feeling that I'm having from this to this particular outcome. But they're also with the zippers and with grommets, there's like an idea that there's more stories. Like there are, just because you're looking at one thing and you're interpreting it one way, when there's the way it came to be and all the context around it, there's so many other factors. So it's kind of nice.
I want to, when we were talking the other day and you said, well, you began to talk about something. I said, oh, have you read Nathaniel Rich's book? And some of you may know Nathaniel Rich. He's an author who lives here in town and who writes about sort of environmental calamity. Can't imagine why he lives here. but his most recent book is really foregrounding the fact that we don't live in a natural world, and so much of both of your practices have look at what we might think of, what we commonly term the natural world versus the subject, right? The figure versus the ground. But that there's when we use that language, we have some suggestion of like, the undisrupted landscape, right? But of course, we're in an utterly disrupted landscape. We no longer live in the pre-man world, right? And so it goes back to that question you were in your TED Talk, of what kind of world, if we're going to be world making, we know we're already world making, what kind of world do we want to make? And it seems to me that both of these tools, they give you a lot of options about how we might resituate history, reframe some of the materials that we have at our disposal. Yeah.
I'm like, yep. I mean, I feel like, I don't know, I guess world making for me is creating a world where, I don't know, I don't like the word marginalized, but you know what I mean. Stories that fall through the cracks kind of get their time in the light. I'm thinking of this video I saw of Miriam Makeba kind of talking about history, and that history is written by the victor. Mm-hmm. And that's something I always think about, just where I grew up and these people that I held to such high esteem, and knowing as I tried to filter through my own history, like there was so much lost. A lot of it was just through stories that like my great grandfather had told my grandma, and you couldn't really ask your parents questions at the time. And for me, it was kind of just heartbreaking, but also being at peace with, there is something that, I don't know, I want the attempt to know, but ultimately if I can't know, then that's fine. But I still want to make the gesture of trying to piece together lineage.
Mm-hmm. This evening's talk is occasioned by the Amistad-Rivers Research Residency. And Troy is our second victim. And with this, we have, you have been spending a lot of time in the extraordinary wealth of materials that is available to anyone, because it is a public archive, and with an exceptional community of archivists dedicated to making those histories that it holds available and circulated and in community. You were here in May, and this trip is the sort of concluding moment to this research residency. I wonder if because as we said, all of this was out of order. So the research residency has actually become a moment to depart from, expound, take a sharp turn from where this recent body of work, Rockavai, led you. And I'm curious to learn, I know, but I'm curious for you to share with others where your research has led in the archive, how it is related to where we've been and where you've been in your practice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I feel spoiled working with Amistad because it's so fun. Like the people that work there, I've had a great time, and it's just like super knowledgeable people, and they're like, did I hear you say this? Well, you should look at this. And I'm like, wow, this is awesome. But
Lisa's laughing because
I know Lisa and Jade. And but one thing I stumbled upon was just these archives from artists in the Harlem Renaissance, which I had known about, but I didn't know specifically about Richmond Barthé. And I became really into his, I don't know, I guess there was something that I could relate to this type of queerness, but also there's something kind of heartbreaking about his archive. And I started to think a lot about the lives that we lead, and having the photograph is kind of the only representation. So it's looking through his photo albums. There's like ones of him posing with his sculptures and other artist friends, but then there's like anonymous ones of like young handsome men, and I'm like, okay, what is this about? But it just says like there's no like classification for it. So I'm interested in kind of these books that are supposed to hold our lives and our memories. And even at that, there's something that will get lost in translation. And it's been kind of funny just reading the correspondence between like him and Harold Jackman and County Cullen. And recently I was looking at the archives of Richard Bruce Nugent, who was a very, I don't know, making that work at that time. I don't know, it's, in a way I feel like I'm looking at these people who really paved the way. And that's something I think that also gets downplayed in the Harlem Renaissance, that a lot of these writers and performers and artists were queer. Mm-hmm. That's something that always gets left out of the dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Which, also comes back to questions about the archive, where, how does, and we've had these conversations internally, papers get bequeathed with certain terms associated. What is to be circulated? How are they supposed to be narrated? What can be shared? What can't be shared? And so even the archival histories are partial. And I think one of the really thrilling parts for me as a curator and sort of witness to artist research in the archive has been this kind of resuturing, to go back to questions of sewing, of reciting some of these histories in complex histories that may not figure as readily or as transparently in the archive, but there's work to be done to piece back together how parts of a life might be lived. For both of you, I think we've had so many conversations, and your practices are so rooted in questions of landscape and it's impossible, especially, we were saying this the other day, actually looking at some of your recent works, which so easily could be rendered as garments because of their hanging structures. But there is always that place of the figure that, these landscapes are holding space for figures and subjectivity, and that relationship persists across. I have enjoyed this conversation so much with both of you, and I want to afford the opportunity for any questions in the audience. Anyone? Any brave soul?
I draw a lot of inspiration from stuff that I just see walking around. But I guess specifically, I've been printing out photos on it's like one of the slides that you showed was like some like large prints that I did, and I just kind of was dragging them around, bringing them from one studio downstairs to cut this thing and sew them and stuff. And I kind of just, everything that happens in the process of trying to make the thing, I just I keep telling myself, because you don't want to get too precious about it, but just being everything that happens while I'm making this is a part of its life. And I just let all of that process, whether it's dirt or my dog walking on it, in its life with me. I just that's becomes layers of meaning that are just embedded into it, if it's dinged or broken or ripped in some way while I have it. But then also I think I wasn't doing sculpture really until I guess I was. Other people might argue and say I was doing it this whole time, but I wasn't really doing it. And then I just kind of started to see things that I found a pile of wood next to the London Avenue Canal on Allen Toussaint Boulevard by the bridge. And then I was okay, I need to make this. I was okay, here's the material. So I guess I need to clean this wood and turn it into a thing, because the earth is just we have left so much stuff. There's so much stuff everywhere, that we're kind of being given opportunities to make things all the time. And you had some sculptures in your show that I loved.
Yeah, I did. Sculpture is a scary word.
Oh, sorry.
Assemblage. Assemblage.
No, I mean,
how did you kind of...
When I quit painting in grad school, I hung out a lot with the sculptors, because I was I want to see it in real life. I don't want to paint it or depict it. And then sculptors are very critical, so then I backed away. I don't know, sometimes it just feels, I use intuition a lot, and I like hearing you talk about kind of the materials going through their own history in your studio and with you, because that happens in my studio, where I collect something and it's like, whoa, I love that weird green piece of wood and I just need it, and it may sit there for years or it may be an instant connection, but there's a lot of like juxtaposition that's happening with from which for me I guess feels like dialogues. Like I think visual art is a language which at times is hard to put into everyday language, but it's like, okay, does the green piece of wood work with this thing or that thing, and it's just knowing like inside if that's correct or not. But I think being an older millennial there was something about handling a photograph which for me is as an object was so important and very intimate, but also knowing that the photograph is a record of something that's confined by its frame. So I have no knowledge of what's beyond that frame, which could totally change the narrative that it's being depicted. But I am very interested in the life of objects, which is why I scan things still, even with the problematic magazines. I still scan them just to have some type of record of proof of their existence before I work into them. I mean, the images, oof. How do I choose the images? I've noticed now with the years of collaging, I'm drawn to high contrast imagery. I like kind of older forms of photography. And I think it's because there's something about analog that feels more weighted and malleable, as opposed to digital can feel very cold and slick. So I do like materials that are a little bit more matte. And I don't know, there's something about like handling that material. A lot of these older magazines, they were just printed better, like thicker cardstock. And strangely enough, in those magazines, there's so much like modernist design, like things that you would never see now, like weird croppings, a lot of empty space. And it is interesting to see like the history of publication from, I guess I've worked with things from like the 20s up until now, like how everything feels a lot thinner, a lot more slick, a lot more photoshopped, a lot more glossy, where before it felt like more, I don't know, it felt like more like a weighted object than maybe imagery now. Photographs. I'm trying to think, do I use photographs? Not so much. I mean, like the actual...
I contest. I think it's false.
Not family photographs.
Family photographs.
I do also source a lot from online. Yeah, so I do a lot of online searches, like El Paso, Texas, and so I use a lot of like press photography that's been discarded. But in terms of like family photographs, I still can't do that.
I'm really drawn to images where there's like a dramatic thing happening in the picture, even when I'm taking them. Like, just, I mean, I think that might even come from the basketball cards, because like in a basketball card, it's like you already know what's going on. Like someone is like blocking, reaching, they're doing some very dramatic thing, which is like the center point of that. And I feel like spending so much time staring at those and like searching for the perfect like finesse moment, kind of like in my own photography, like when I'm looking at what I want to make a collage with, it's kind of like these things that have this like dramatic, not dramatic, but very graphic action, which might honestly like the contrast too, you know. But sometimes I'll like impose that on it. But I love also things that can be like inside or outside. Like it's kind of like you can't really tell maybe where the photo is being taken from, or some kind of mix up or abstraction with that. Yeah, so I kind of look for that. And it's interesting that you mentioned the digital and analog, because I was taking digital photographs when I was exploring that, but then I just started using only film photography. And so I've been noticing that just by chance, I'm like, oh, I want to put this one with this one, but it's a digital and an analog. And the analog it just has like a depth and a warmth to it that, you know, your eye feels like when you look at it. There's a subtlety or a softness of the color or the paper that you just you can see the vintageness of it, which I think just now that we have every type of photography and image reproduction available, each one of those choices like changes the affect of the overall experience with it, which is kind of a fun thing about technology, that we can utilize all those different tools, but other stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you to Troy. Thank you to Ashley. So grateful to everyone who could be here, but also to the whole team at Amistad and at Rivers who's made this research residency possible. Please, we are celebrating tonight with. I think Ashley was the one who gave Troy the original recommendation to go to Little Dizzy's when he first came here, and he took it to heart. He has had more meals at Little Dizzy's in a very short window of time.
Good.
So we decided to gift him on his way out with a Little Dizzy's feast, and we hope you will join us outside for refreshment and nourishment. So thank you all.
Thanks, y'all, for coming.